Hello, hello. You're listening to Watchman Radio, coming to you from the Motor City, Motown. And we're playing some soul music. If you feel like dancing, you get up and move around. Well, you can take your seats. I want to talk about God, specifically about God's greatness. You know, we can read words in the book, in the Bible. It tells us that God is glorious. He's majestic. He's vastly superior to us humans. In fact, he is almighty. But do we really appreciate that? Can we really appreciate how great God is? I don't think so. I think, in many ways, God understates his greatness. We just can't comprehend it. We cannot comprehend the vastness of the universe. Not when you really try to put your mind around it. Back hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, men would look up at the sky and they had no idea what they were looking at. They could see the moon, of course, and the sun, but those specks of light, and some of them were moving around, and nobody really knew what they were. But with the invention of the telescope, and in more recent years, radio telescopes. And by the way, if you're watching this video, these images are taken from the Hubble telescope. These are not computer-generated images, but actual footage taken from space by the Hubble. And what a sight it is. With telescopes opening up the sky to our minds, it is simply staggering how big the universe is and how really, 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 really small we are. We're like microscopic compared to the vastness of what God has created, this visible universe. Back before men looked up with a telescope, you could count about 5,000 so-called stars with the naked eye. Men thought they were stars. But as they started looking deeper and deeper into the night sky, what did we find out? Well, those tiny little specks of light that were thought to be stars are actually galaxies. We live in what is called the Milky Way galaxy, of course. And if you live in a dark place, you can't see it in the city and really appreciate it. But if you live out in the country and you look up and you see that band of white, that's why they call it the Milky Way. It's a band of thick whiteness across the night sky. That effect is produced because we're out on the outer arm. If you look down at a diagram of our Milky Way, it has these spiral arms that go out. Well, we are out on one of those spiral arms. And that Milky Way, you see, that strip through the night sky, that is our vantage point as we're looking crossways through our galaxy. And there are hundreds of billions of stars in our Milky Way galaxy. They're so thick that is what it gives it that milky-like appearance. So now we realize that there are lots of Milky Ways out there. They're not stars. They're galaxies, and each of them have hundreds of billions of stars. How many galaxies are there? They're not sure, but there's a whole bunch of them, hundreds of billions. So it is really impossible to comprehend. When you start talking about trillions, and that's what we're talking about, trillions of stars, we can't comprehend $1 trillion, really. I mean, it's just beyond our mental capacity to really, but that's what we're talking about. There are more stars in the heavens than there are grains of sand on the seashore. All the sand on planet Earth. Think of that the next time you take your shoes off and are walking on a sandy beach, if you have that privilege. It really is mind-blowing that the universe is so big. Well, if we appreciate that God created it, what is He in relation to this vast universe? Well, I would like to read a passage to you. In fact, it's in the 40th chapter of Isaiah. And as you may or may not know, Isaiah was written some 700 years before Jesus. So it was written a long time ago. And it's interesting that God, He tries to get us to comprehend our position relative to Him and how He is incomparable. He makes fun of those who would try to make an idol likeness of Him, because you can't. How could you? How could you make some likeness to the Creator of the universe? But in verse number 12, He's trying to give us an approximation of His greatness. And He says, "Who has measured waters in the hollow of His hand, and taken the measurements of the heavens with a span of His hands?" Of His hand, excuse me. What does that mean? Well, He's using a human term here. God doesn't have a hand, of course. He's trying to explain things so we can get a little bit of understanding. The span of a man's hand is the length from the end of the thumb across the breadth of your hand to the tip of your little pinky. That's the span. So now think about this vast universe, which apparently, I don't know if it has an end or not, but these trillions of stars, and God measures it with the span of His hand. He's trying to give us an idea of His greatness relative to His creation. He goes even further to try to help us not think in such small ways. He asks the question, "Who has gathered in a measure the dust of the earth, or weighed the mountains in the balances and the hills in the scales. Well, if you've ever stood next to a big mountain or seen one from a distance, you know it is massive, and there are many mountain ranges around the earth and hills and valleys, and God is as if he picks them all up and puts them on a little scale and to see how much they weigh. He goes on. Who has taken the measurements of the Spirit of Jehovah, and who can instruct him as his advisor? With whom did God consult to gain understanding? Or who teaches him in the path of justice? Or who teaches him knowledge? Or who shows him the way of true understanding? Look, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and as the film of dust on the scales, they are regarded. Look, he lifts up the islands like fine dust. Verse 17, he says, all the nations are as something non-existent in front of him. He regards them as nothing, as a non-reality. Now think about that. Especially the nations at this point in time with all of their massive technology, nuclear missiles, the submarines that can fire warheads and destroy entire nations. The nations are as a drop from a bucket. They are regarded as film on the scale. They are non-existent in front of him. I think a lot of people would have a hard time accepting that because people think they're so great. Well, we ain't so great, especially compared to God. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. Let it sink in, and we'll do some more Motown. As Christians, we appreciate that Jehovah sent his only begotten Son down, and Jesus said that he had come to explain the Father. Now, in view of the fact, as we try to appreciate that God is so awesome and incomprehensible and so much greater than we are as tiny little grasshoppers, Jesus explained God and magnified his kindness. When we think about God's greatness in comparison with a human, there's no comparison. How about a sparrow? Well, again, no comparison between the Creator and the thing created. But Jesus revealed something quite extraordinary about his Heavenly Father. He said that not a sparrow falls to the earth without God's knowledge. He is aware of every single feathered little bird. And Jesus said that to impress upon us that God is concerned with us, not simply with sparrows, but primarily with humans. And that's, of course, is why Jesus sacrificed his life to make it possible for Jehovah to rescue us from death. Provided, of course, that we avail ourselves of his provisions. And God exhorts us to do that. Before I wander too far off the track here, we were considering those verses in the 40th chapter of Isaiah. And the verse that I originally read, verse 12, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and taken the measurements of the heavens with a span of his hand. Well, if you scroll up just a couple of verses to verse 10, it puts this into relation with a particular point in time, and it's actually in the future. God is speaking to us at a point when the world is thrown into chaos. And that's why, if we back up even further, he says that all flesh is green grass, and all their loyal love is like the blossom of the field. The green grass dries up, the blossom withers, because the breath of Jehovah blows upon it. The green grass dries up, the blossom withers, but the word of our God endures forever. So people are not really inclined to listen to God right now, but it will be as if he blows upon us, and we recognize our own insignificance, our own frailty, and the comparison to grass drying up. You know, if a hot, dry breeze blows upon it for any length of time, the grass turns yellow, and that's it, unless it gets some rain. But here now we're considering Isaiah, and it's speaking about a future time when Jehovah establishes his kingdom, when Jesus returns, when he comes in the name of his Father to set matters straight, to deal with the devil and his system of things. That's what we're talking about. And that's why it stresses in Isaiah that the word of God endures forever. Because God made these promises a long time ago. He's recorded them in this book. And although this system is going to be thrown into convulsions, God's word endures forever. So now verse 10, look, the sovereign Lord Jehovah will come with power, and his arm will rule for him. Look, his reward is with him, and the wage he pays is before him. Keep that in mind. Like a shepherd, he will care for his flock. With his arm, he will gather together the lambs, and in his bosom, he will carry them, and he will gently lead those nursing their young. And that's when God goes on to say, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? So it will look as if all is lost. And that is when God will come through. But it's really talking about Jesus, because in the very last chapter of the Bible, in Revelation, Jesus describes himself as coming and his wage being before him. In other words, he's coming to reward his slaves and also to punish those who've not been faithful. But again, speaking of God's greatness, yes, he's coming with power, but notice that he cares for his flock. He will gather his lambs. If you've ever seen a little flock of sheep, the lambs are so vulnerable to predators. And here Jehovah is saying, just like Christ said, Jehovah cares for every sparrow. He's looking for his sheep, his flock, that by that time will have been scattered. Didn't Jesus say that when the Son of Man comes, a trumpet will sound and his angels will go to gather his chosen ones from the four corners? Well, there's also a great crowd to be gathered during the tribulation, and they come out of the tribulation. I'd like to read to you an article written a few years ago, 2016. I spoke about this a few days ago as when is the shaking? But this is a commentary I'd written, when is the great crowd? Not where is the great crowd. Some people think they're in heaven, but they're mistaken. When is the great crowd, though? Because the Watchtower says that the great crowd was formed back before World War II. So I'm not going to read the text. This is actually a commentary taken on the daily text, but they mention the great crowd coming out of the tribulation and the survivors and so forth. Here's the commentary, though. In 1935, J.F. Rutherford spoke on the topic of the great multitude at a national convention of the newly named Jehovah's Witnesses. He asked those in attendance who did not entertain the heavenly calling to please stand up. He thus introduced the great multitude, as the traditional King James Version phrased it, all those who were to survive the Great Tribulation. But alas, in all likelihood, all of those Jonadabs, as they were called then, have died off, thus rendering it impossible for them to come out of the Great Tribulation. I suppose it is feasible that if someone had been born, say, around 1916, making them 19 or 20 years old in 1935, they could still be alive now at 100 years of age. But surely that entire World War I generation has, for the most part, passed away. The point is, the great crowd are identified by one characteristic. They come out of the Great Tribulation. Obviously, no one has come out of the tribulation alive for the simple reason that the world's greatest time of trouble has not occurred. So while Rutherford may have correctly interpreted the great multitude as being composed of sanctified believers who will live on earth after the Battle of Armageddon, those 800-plus souls whom Rutherford identified as the original members of the great multitude were not really, for the reason already stated. The question really is, when is the great multitude? When does it form? The answer is, the great crowd is gathered during the tribulation, not before. That truth is expressed in the prophecy of Haggai, which states, "For this is what Jehovah of armies says, yet once more, in a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry ground. And I will shake all the nations, and the precious things of all the nations will come in. And I will fill this house with glory, says Jehovah of armies." The Watchtower teaches that God began shaking the nations in 1914. Supposedly, God has been rocking the nations over the course of the past century. However, the fact of the matter is, since the last great spasm of war, known as World War II, ended, the world has enjoyed a remarkable period of relative peace and stability. Indeed, consider that after the war ended, there were only about 250,000 active Jehovah's Witnesses in the world. That number doubled in the span of 5 years. Can that be attributed to the nations being rocked by war? Of course not. Just the opposite. From 1950 to the present, the organization has grown because of the peace and stability of the world, not because God has been violently shaking the nations. Jesus spoke of the heavens being shaken and the sea being violently driven. Here's what he said. Also, there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth anguish of nations not knowing the way out because of the roaring of the sea and its agitation. People will become faint out of fear and expectation of the things coming upon the inhabited earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But as these things start to occur, stand up straight, lift up your heads, because your deliverance is getting near. For many decades, the Watchtower taught that the nations had been in anguish, not knowing the way out ever since 1914. The February 15, 1988 Watchtower, however, was the last time the organization applied Jesus' words to the past. Starting with April 1st, 1990, the Watchtower unceremoniously shifted to a future fulfillment. But what that means is that these things have not started to occur yet. Hence, there is no tangible evidence that our deliverance is getting near. Since Christ connected deliverance, or salvation, with nations being in anguish and men becoming faint with fright, while the powers of the heavens are shaken, it is apparent that the shaking Jehovah spoke of in Haggai coincides with the great tumult Christ foretold, which the Watchtower now even admits has not begun yet. Paul indicated as much too. Quoting the prophecy of Haggai, the inspired apostle wrote at Hebrews 12:26 through 27. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. Now the expression, yet once more, indicates the removal of the things that are shaken, things that have been made, in order that the things not shaken may remain. The time Jehovah's voice shook the earth was when he spoke to Moses on the mountain. Paul indicated that the earth is due another shaking when Jehovah speaks, a shaking that will result in the utter annihilation of the present system, including the Watchtower. What will remain? The next verse says, therefore, seeing that we are to receive a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us continue to receive undeserved kindness, through which we may acceptably offer God sacred service with godly fear and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. The kingdom is the only institution that will remain. Therefore, those who come out of the tribulation are brought not into any sort of visible organization, but into the kingdom. Indeed, even the Watchtower, with all their irrational attachment to 1914, unwittingly acknowledges that the great crowd have not been gathered yet. That is because about 20 years ago, the governing body revised their teaching regarding the separation of the sheep and the goats, placing it into the future. That is when the king will say to the sheep, come, you who've been blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the founding of the world. Appropriately, the 7th chapter of Revelation depicts the great crowd as standing before the throne. While some unreasoning persons imagine that to be a reference to their being in heaven, the illustration of the sheep and the goats takes place when the Son of Man arrives in his glory and sits down upon his throne. Obviously, though, the goats that are sent into everlasting fire, prepared for Satan and his angels, are not in heaven. Hence, standing before the throne means that they are judged here upon the earth. And since the sheep, who are blessed with entry into the kingdom, are blessed due to their having supported Christ's brothers during their tribulation, it is evident that the great crowd are formed as a result of being drawn into the unshakable kingdom during the great shaking yet to come. That's the end of that article. And I just want to stress that that is the setting in which Jehovah speaks to us in the 40th chapter of Isaiah. And he stresses his greatness, but also his compassion upon his sheep and the complete unreality of humans upon this earth who try to oppose God. Just one more verse from that 40th chapter. Verse 21, he says, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? There is one who dwells above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He reduces high officials to nothing and makes judges of the earth an unreality." So again, when men set up this last king, this eighth king, and try to dominate everyone and bludgeon everyone into worshiping this idol, Jehovah says, no, these men are nothing. He's speaking to encourage us to have faith in him, not to be fearful. Didn't Jesus stress, do not be afraid, do not be terrorized? Because men are going to be terrorized. Men will become faint with fear when God shakes the earth, when he allows this tribulation to begin. It's going to be terrifying. And that's when we need to remember God's greatness and his compassion and have faith. Thank you for listening. Hope to speak to you tomorrow.